Testimony for the Slovakian investigation into COVID-19. Good day. My name is Charles Rixey, and I'm a member of Drastic, an international group of scientists and researchers who've been investigating the origin of the pandemic since 2020. Prior to the pandemic, I spent my military career as a seaburn specialist in the United States Marine Corps. I served as a warrant officer instructor at the USMC Seaburn School and later as the curriculum developer. I also spent 8 years across 2 tours as the Seaburn Chief for Marine Corps Embassy Security Group, the headquarters for Marines that guard 188 embassies and consulates for the Department of State. Since the pandemic, I've been a leading member of Drastic, where my primary projects have focused on scientific censorship, FOIA documents, suspicious elements of the SARS-CoV-2 genome, and the epidemiology of the outbreak in Wuhan. I've communicated and/or collaborated with several U.S. congressional investigative committees, authored affidavits for multiple pending legal proceedings, and was personally hired by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to assist in the research for the sequel to his The Real Anthony Fauci book. In addition, I was the person who worked with Major Joseph Murphy, now Lieutenant Colonel Murphy, to leak the diffused documents in September of 2021. And that's why I have him pictured alongside me today. Today, I'm going to discuss gain of function work and how it coincides with bioweapons research. Then I will discuss the conclusions of all of my research over the last 4 years, as well as the implications of those conclusions on future investigations. I want to note that all of the work that you see here is available in a publicly available Excel workbook on ResearchGate. First, I'm going to discuss what gain of function actually means. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the definition. However, there is an actual US government definition for the types of experiments that gain of function concerns. In this case, this includes experiments that lead to enhanced harmful consequences of pathogens or toxins, disrupts immunity or the effectiveness of an immunization against the agent or toxin, experiments that confer to agents or toxins resistance to prophylactics or therapeutics, or facilitates their ability to evade detection methodologies, increases stability, transmissibility, or the ability to disseminate an agent or toxin. And then, most importantly for our purposes, alters the host range or tropism of the agent or toxin, meaning it allows a pathogen, a virus in this instance, to be able to infect a broader range of human cells. Now, keeping those in mind, I went through those 7 categories and how they relate to SARS-CoV-2. And as you can see here, all 7 of the categories that are listed as official gain-of-function experiments are either directly or indirectly fulfilled by SARS-CoV-2, the virus itself, or our response to the virus. And in one of the tabs in my Excel workbook, I've listed out with links different papers, many of them written by implicated scientists since 2020, talking about how the SARS-CoV-2 virus contains many of these gain-of-function features. When it comes to bioweapons, a, a select group of expert NATO scientists and former military CBRN personnel in 2022 looked at the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the context of what a potential of categories or different means or attributes you would want inside a biological weapon. The same group in 2018 had published a study where they went through 33 known or potential bioweapons candidates, a variety of bacteria, toxins, viruses, rickettsia, etc. And they ranked them according to 12 different criteria. And when you put all these together, they put them in order, and they ranked the most attractive pathogens for use as biological weapons. And in 2022, they did the same using the same criteria with SARS-CoV-2. And what they discovered is that SARS-CoV-2, when compared to all of those other known or potential bioweapons, would rank as the fourth most attractive bioweapon potential. And as I should note that the only virus that ranks above it is the smallpox virus. I've also gone through and shown that when you look at the virus in terms of how transmissible it was, which is one of those categories, and you compare it to the most well-known and the most infectious viruses to humans, we can see here that in particular, the Omicron variant of SARS-CoV-2 is amongst the most infectious and transmissible viruses in the history of humankind. Now, when we think about the context of those categories of experiments, we want to make sure to see, okay, were these experiments being done? And here I've compiled a list of more than 50 papers published over the past 2 decades that shows a pathway of a list of experiments done in the United States, in Europe, in China, in Australia, and in Singapore, all of which produce a logical sequence, a pathway of learning and technologies to produce a virus that looks like SARS-CoV-2. And then, of course, when we zoom in at the evidence, we can specifically see that EcoHealth Alliance was acting as a partner between all these different organizations across these different countries. And in addition, was also working directly with the Wuhan Institute of Virology and providing, serving as a conduit for certain technologies and ideas that came from the United States. They weren't the only group that was doing this. Certainly, Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina was also heavily involved. But here, for instance, we see a Department of State cable where they're talking about a request using USAID and money to pay for work to be done to investigators will use mice that have been genetically modified to express the human receptor for SARS-CoV. All work involving samples and viral isolates from bats will be performed at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And then, of course, something that I'm intimately familiar with, we have the diffuse proposal, a proposal that was not public, but which contains within it a series of elements that 5 in particular that they don't talk about in normal public published papers, but they did propose explicitly in this proposal to DARPA, an agency of the Department of Defense here in the United States. And those 5 key characteristics that they propose: chimeric construction, the insertion of human cleavage sites, looking for coronaviruses that can utilize the DC sign receptor, which is also a pathway that is utilized by HIV. Looking for coronaviruses with high ACE2 affinity, and in particular, interferon dysregulation. All 5 of these elements, which have never appeared before in the same coronavirus in nature, appear within the SARS-CoV-2 genome. Now, why is furin so important? When you look at on the left-hand side, it shows that 2 main receptors for the original SARS virus were ACE2 and TMPRSS2. And then when you look on the right-hand side, you can see a comparison of furin in what tissues furin can infect as opposed to the original SARS virus. And as you can see, furin opens the pathway directly to the brain, to other nervous tissue, more intensely to the lungs, to the liver, and to throughout the body using in the circulatory system. This is why furin has been so attractive for bioweapons research, in particular, because when furin goes wrong inside the body, it can intensify the probabilities of cancer, diabetes, inflammation, and neurodegenerative and neurological conditions. And it's not a coincidence that furin can also be found, or the ability to utilize furin can also be found within certain viruses and bacteria. And as it just so happens, the very bacteria and viruses that can utilize furin cleavage are also the same ones that are most attractive as potential bioweapons. So here I take the same list of 34 pathogens and toxins that were potential bioweapons, and I show which ones have furin cleavage, can be cleaved by furin, or cleaved by furin-like proprotein convertases. And I also show in orange, the 2 in the middle, Lassa virus and Nipah virus. Those are 2 viruses where furin cleavage has been artificially inserted. And then I also want to highlight that the red one near the top, in the 7th position of most attractive bioweapons, staphylococcal enterotoxin B, which was actively stockpiled in US bioweapons stockpiles in the 50s and 60s, is number 7 on this list. And as it just so happens, a 13 or 14 amino acid SEB toxin-like sequence appears within the SARS-CoV-2 genome. In fact, it overlaps with the furin cleavage site, one of the main inserts that make it different from the original SARS. In addition to these capabilities with furin and the other receptors that the SARS-CoV-2 virus has, the SARS-CoV-2 virus also displays incredibly durable virions, much more durable than in nature. This is an example. This is paper where they took a nano stick and poked individual virions and showed that the SARS-CoV-2 virions are far more pliable than other virions that are seen in nature. I should also note that Robert Gary himself, one of the authors of the proximal origin paper that sought to set a narrative that the virus was natural, in April of 2020, he was author on a paper which showed that the SARS-CoV-2 virus aerosol particles were stable in air for up to 16 hours, as opposed to 3 hours for the original SARS virus. Once again, that is an unnaturally long amount of time when you compare it to other viruses. How special is the SARS-CoV-2 virus? No other sarbecovirus has a polybasic furin cleavage site. No other beta coronavirus has an SEB analog sequence. No other coronavirus has higher human ACE2 affinity than SARS-CoV-2. No other coronavirus contains prion-like domains in the spike protein. And I could go on and on and on. In all of these ways, the SARS-CoV-2 virus is unique. So, what are the conclusions from all of these things that I've just mentioned? Well, we'll go through this list that I put together. I'll just go through it and I will show you, starting with Dr. Fauci and others knew, excuse me, based upon the suspicious elements of the SARS-CoV-2 genome, that the virus had almost certainly been manipulated. They knew that such manipulations likely came from pseudovirus and insertion techniques very familiar to US and Chinese viral, vaccine, and therapeutic medical countermeasure programs. The February 1st teleconference, hosted by Dr. Fauci and Jeremy Farrar, was convened specifically in response to the publication of what's called the Pradhan et al. Preprint and the growing awareness of the furin cleavage site and the so-called HIV insertions. They immediately took steps to censor and control public and scientific discussions related to the HIV inserts and furin cleavage site. These actions are more properly viewed as obstruction of justice. And what I show here is that they did this in multiple ways. First, they dominated the major journals, major scientific journals across in this case, I looked at the top 6, and they prevented any lab origin articles from appearing in those pages. They also did the same in a variety of media and television circles. And I went through several thousand articles to show, in this case, this graph shows the intensity of bias towards or against the lab origin hypothesis. They also did the same on social media, utilizing algorithms and other means of censorship to ensure that voices promoting a natural origin were magnified and those who spoke against it were prevented from spreading their messages. They were able to do this and gain compliance because Dr. Fauci and the NIH control almost 60% of all funding of medical research across the globe, public funding. Many of the scientists implicated in Fauci's gain-of-function research or the pandemic origin cover-up are also involved in earlier origin narrative efforts for HIV-1, Gulf War syndrome, and the 2014 Ebola epidemic in West Africa, including 4 or 5 authors of the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. Beginning on February 3rd of 2020, President Trump's science advisor and OSTP director, Kelvin Drogemeyer, worked with Fauci to withhold information about the U.S. gain-of-function research ties with the Wuhan Institute of Virology from the Trump administration. In fact, it was I who discovered that, later confirmed by congressional investigators. This had major implications for both the early response to the pandemic, ongoing protocols, excuse me, ongoing treatment protocols, and the long-term impact on global public health. Dr. Fauci and his Vaccine Research Center with Moderna finished their vaccine prototype on January 13th, 2020, and knew of the furin cleavage site 1 week before human-human transmission was announced by China. Thus, they knew that the virus was infectious enough to cause a pandemic, yet took steps to suppress this information for 2 months until they could control the narrative via proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 paper. The February 1st teleconference attendees authored 33 papers during that same 2-month period, never mentioning the furin cleavage site. These actions enabled the largely unhindered spread of COVID-19. Dr. Fauci and his Vaccine Research Center's decision to retain the furin cleavage site within their vaccine prototype goes against more than 2 decades of HIV, flu, RSV, and coronavirus vaccine research and development practices. I went through nearly 60 vaccine studies to confirm this trend. This is just showing that in addition to that, the head of Pfizer's vaccine development in 2020, Philip Dormitzer, back in 2014, said explicitly on camera in a gain-of-function debate forum that they would always remove furin cleavage sites if ever they found them in their vaccine development for influenza. HIV-like elements in the SARS-CoV-2 genome are very similar in form and function to current HIV vaccine templates. Some of them being conserved epitope, mosaic, consensus, multiclade, etc., except that the bad parts were retained: the furin cleavage site, prion-like domains, DC sign receptors, etc. Pictured here are the DC sign or GP120 inserts that are found within SARS-CoV-2 taken out of HIV vaccine candidates. Once again, these practices of retention are antithetical to modern vaccine design. For these and other reasons, the SARS-CoV-2 virus does not appear to be a failed vaccine prototype. Dr. Fauci and most global public health officials ignored aerosol transmission, even after the disappearance of the flu and failure of lockdowns and masks. Their actions may have fueled the rise and impact of the Delta variant. Dr. Fauci actively worked to suppress any links between SARS-CoVs and HIV-1, including a class of drugs Robert Gary and Bill Gallagher had helped invent, fusion peptide inhibitors. He blocked many other proven or promising treatments as well, like hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, protease inhibitors, and antibiotics, to name a few. The SARS-CoV-2 genome is mutating at unnatural rates in precisely the areas of the suspicious inserts, exactly what you would see in a virus attempting to return to its natural state. The immune isotype IgG4 class switching that has emerged within vaccinees who received mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccinations is very similar to effects seen in certain previous HIV vaccine trials. The HIV-like inserts, excuse me, within SARS-CoV-2 resemble parts of the GP120 protein in HIV, which drove the unusual IgG4 responses in that earlier trial. Those inserts, as well as these pictured here, produced broad immune suppression. And this immune suppression, especially amongst the unvaccinated, is now fueling exponential rises in early and or fast onset cancers and amyloid neurodegenerative conditions like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The combined immune dysregulation effects of furin, DC sign, ENaC, and the SCB-like superantigen motif may also explain how SARS-CoV-2 can spread via aerosol transmission. The unprecedented and consecutive overlapping of the SCB, furin cleavage site, ENaC elements exponentially increases SARS-CoV-2's ability to infect human lungs. Here, this is showing that the tissues where DC sign is most expressed is the lymph nodes and the placenta, which explains a lot for people who got sick severely with COVID, as well as certain problems that we may be experiencing now with fertility. The furin cleavage site, HIV-like inserts, immune dysregulation, and chimeric viral construction were four key features that were described as project goals within the diffuse proposal that EcoHealth Alliance submitted to DARPA in March 2018. Neither Dr. Fauci nor the US intelligence community disclosed this proposal in testimony or in the Biden report on the origin of SARS-CoV-2. They covered up what is in fact proof of intent to produce a virus much like the one that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. And once again, without Major Murphy leaking those documents to me, the world would not even know about the diffuse proposal. So the implications. SARS-CoV-2 contains multiple suspicious elements. These elements were exactly what Fauci and other Western scientists sought to censor discussions of. These elements have been common in bioweapons research and development throughout the West for decades. These elements and/or our response to them fit all 7 categories of gain-of-function experiments. Many of these elements were explicitly listed in the diffuse proposal, which the intelligence community hid and lied about to Congress and to the American people. The U.S. Health and Human Services, public health apparatus, and DoD agencies colluded with the intelligence community to censor discussions about the origin of COVID, as well as scientific research which went against the narrative or questioned the scientific rationale for new medical countermeasures. In summary, my testimony is derived from 4 years of investigation, during which I have gone through more than 3,000 scientific articles and more than 150,000 pages of FOIA and other government documents. I've already provided multiple legal affidavits and remain ready to testify under oath to the veracity of the evidence in support of my conclusions. My conclusions involve implications that are horrific, regardless of which scientists from which countries are ultimately responsible for creating SARS-CoV-2. I applaud your efforts there in Slovakia to investigate those crimes against humanity, and I offer my testimony on behalf of the victims of the COVID-19 pandemic and response who cannot speak for themselves. I will not stop fighting for justice for these victims, and I pray for success in your investigations to achieve that goal. Semper Fidelis.